You were here with us last week, Thursday, when Peggy did present her Module 4, which provided a great foundation for a sort of deeper examination of a Jamaican case study and the St. Vincent case study. I want to remind us that one of the questions we asked at the very beginning, inspired by Andaye, is how do we organize to live? And we felt that in order to do that now, we had to look back at what did happen pre-independence, post-independence, generally in the region, because it's a couple decades ago, but there are many lessons to be learned. And so today, I am going to share some ideas and information about the Jamaican case, and then we'll have a discussion, and Peggy will then make her intervention and share a little bit about how and why St. Vincent actually adopted a similar economic development model. But before I do that, I just want to ask, did everybody get a chance to look at the video with Mikey Witter? Did anybody get a chance to look at the video with Mikey Witter?
Yes, I did.
Okay, because that video provides some of the main talking points for the presentation today. We were also trying to get online, I think Roberta tried really hard, the Life and Death documentary, which really provides even more details, but more on that later. Is everybody online? Can you see the PowerPoint? So I'm going to proceed. Is that okay?
Yeah, you won't be able to hear them. You just have to assume it's okay. If anybody wants to say anything, they just have to unmute their mic.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
I see people confirming on the chat, Jude. So I don't know whether you can see that, but people are confirming on the chat.
Okay, I'll turn on the chat, yes.
Okay, so I'd remind us that going into independence, as a colonial state, we inherited some inequalities. Because sometimes I get the feeling that we forget that Jamaica has always, and the Caribbean, has always been in the global economy in a way that we didn't determine how we were inserted. And that had implications for the kinds of decisions the nascent independent government would have been able to make, etc. What is interesting is that some of the inequalities we inherited from the colonial period are still with us today. One could say we have made some progress, but if you listen to the complaints around the region and you look at the data, there are still unemployment levels that are too high, and housing and education and health. All those things that need to be improved or eliminated to deal with the abject poverty that we have are with us. So I just wanted to put that on the table. In summary then, in Jamaica at 1962, we inherited a colonial state which had an economy that was underdeveloped, meaning it had not been developed primarily for the benefit of the local manufacturing, production centers, but for Britain. And it was severely dependent on those external connections. So post-independence, there were aspirations, of course, of what this new period will bring Jamaica. But the data tells us that some of those inequalities got worse, and the development model of that time in the 60s actually exacerbated some of the conditions. I just wanted to make the point that it was bad enough to fuel industrial unrest, and you read about radical political activities. Dr. Witter spoke about some of those, and the cultural expressions like Rastafari, which were popular but suppressed. So that was a very turbulent period. But what happens sometimes in the narrative, you only hear about the GDP growth that took place. Yes, it did. But the wealthy classes were the ones that benefited, and other conditions that affected people's lives were severe, and the inequalities gotten worse. The next slide, I want you to quickly remind us that Jamaica was at the center of a global political economic struggle, ideological struggle. And that, of course, because we were so dependent on external sources for almost everything, it really constrained our ability to develop our local economy again, because we were dependent on a few markets, the same markets that were involved in the ideological struggle, to buy the basic things we needed, the food, the energy, the raw materials, and medicines. And that part of our history is oftentimes not spoken about enough. So I just want to move along now to the origins of Jamaica's debt problem. Following Dr. Witter's guidance, I identified a couple of years which were real turning points, right? So in 1972, the previous decade had been unsatisfactory to the majority of people. So under Michael Manley's leadership, the mantra was better must come, because we have to do better than what we achieved in the early post-independent period. Now, in 73, this is the point I want us to remember. The prices of imported energy, oil, and food rose dramatically. So overnight, the Jamaican economy had to literally find the foreign reserves or the foreign exchange to buy oil and food at 2 or 3 times more than it was a couple of weeks before that time. And in addition to that, on the local economy, our bauxite, our main export, was not earning what it should have. And there was political interference, so that our tourism wasn't doing well either. So the earnings from that was down. And in those days, there was one bank you could go to as a country to get money to borrow. So that is where our IMF programs began as a result of the debt. In the meantime, the Manley government did what it was committed to do, introducing a wide range of social programs, all listed on this slide, through legislation, importantly, some of which we are benefiting from until today. But those social programs cost money, and the government itself wasn't earning enough, so that further indebted us. And that is also described as mismanagement, okay? In another narrative. I haven't put it here, but there are other sources that will reflect for you the way the local private sector at the time was hostile to the Manley government, and therefore played its own role in destabilizing the economy and the society. So despite that, 76, the PNP won another election. Now this is taking place in the 70s, 76, in which the hemisphere is in the middle of an intense ideological struggle. So there was a lot of internal activism, pro-Manley and against Manley, which helped to destabilize the government. So it's not surprising that they lost the elections. So in summary, just to reaffirm that we were a dependent colonial state with an underdeveloped economy, which could not meet the needs and expectations of the majority of Jamaicans at independence. And the social legislations and programs for the majority of was provided by the Mali government, they also expose the stratification along the lines of race, class, and gender. And then you had the indebtedness of the IMF to the IMF agreements and the structural adjustment programs, as they were called then, in the context of an ideological Cold War. So I think I'm going to stop there. That's a lot. Does anybody want to raise any questions or clarify anything, please? Okay. So the next thing is now I'm asking us to think about Jamaica, but also your countries, most of whom have an IMF agreement, and reflect on how the state itself has been reoriented and the economy is reorganized primarily to service the debt. Are you hearing me? I'm hearing somebody. Are you asking a question? Hello? I'm not hearing whoever is trying to talk.
Judith, they're not trying to talk, they're just not muted. Everyone, please mute your buttons. I'm going to mute.
Okay, so here is really, in order to help us make a connection to what is happening today, I'm encouraging us to think about in your own country, reflect on what is your experience now of the state? Do you get a sense that the state has been reoriented itself and the economy reorganized in order to service the debt? Because that is one of the main objectives of structural adjustment programs, or the new language now is macroeconomic reforms. So they use a policy tool, the policy as a tool to change the policies, and then it becomes a law. Because if you look at a structural adjustment agreement, they have what they call structural benchmarks. I encourage you to go to the website, IMF website, and look for your country's agreement, and you'll see if there are structural benchmarks, and many of them require changing a law in Parliament. And many of them require reorganizing, i.e. liberalizing the economy, especially foreign exchange. Increase taxes. Sorry? Hello?
Hi, this is Maggie.
So we're all familiar with GCT and VAT? General consumption tax and VAT, which is a way of extracting wealth from those sections of our societies that are most vulnerable and themselves living in conditions of poverty, to the owners of the various services and goods that they have to purchase.
Excuse
me. It's a way for the government to earn revenue. Yes?
Yeah, just a quick clarification. Is it the same, GCT and VAT? Because I'm from the Dominican Republic and I understand clearly what it means, but in terms of practically we have the VAT. I don't know if they are usually two different taxes. It's just a silly question, but just to me.
No, it's not I think the principle is the same. So for example, it's a way of direct taxation.
Yeah, I'm clear with that.
Goods and services.
If they mean two taxes usually for other islands in the Caribbean, or is it usually just one or the other?
It's one or the other.
Okay, great.
I believe.
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah, perfect.
Right. So while those taxes are increased, often on the most basic goods, which many women and their families actually have to have, there is reduced spending on social programs and public sector wages to free up resources to help pay the debt. So this is what I'm arguing, that is how the state is reoriented, no longer taking responsibility for providing services, proper healthcare, proper education, social development programs. It has been reoriented away from that to finding resources in many different ways, identifying so many revenue streams to help pay off the debt. Can anybody share what they might have observed in their own countries in respect of anything like this, whether it's a VAT or a GCT, or you are aware that public sector workers often have to work for 3, 4, 5 years before they can get a 2% increased salary because there is a ceiling on the percentage that the public sector wage bill should be. And so the government has to negotiate with the unions to ensure that their overall wage bill does not exceed a certain level. So that is reduced spending on public sector wages. And those are the same people that we are relying on to keep our social services going, the health and the education and the security forces. Can anybody share anything from your experience or observation of your situation in your country?
Hi, this is me again. I'm Maria.
Yes.
I just wanted to share something different that happens here in relation to that, to public expenditure and public services jobs, which is that when the government implements austerity policies to pay debt, they usually take more money. First, they do increase the VAT, and also they reduce the social expenditure in social services and social programs. But because we have around 40% of the formal employment in public services, they usually do not impact so much on the public services jobs and their salaries. And they are not so well, I mean, they are unionized outside the rest of the economy. They have a special union that's under a ministry of government. But they use this for political, I mean, they count everybody that works in the government as a vote. So they have been using this differently, but ultimately it's impacted all society anyways, because the reduction goes into the social services and the public plans, yeah.
Thank you, Maria. So here's what I want to ask you and our colleagues too. Given that social reproduction under rights is the foundation of the economy, of all sectors of the economy, if some of the services that women and their families need are underfunded, they cannot get basic services in a clinic or a hospital, and the schools teachers are migrating, like in Jamaica, at a rate of hundreds per year. What does that say about how the social reproductive practice, responsibility that falls on women and their families? I think often, certainly in public discourse, the average private sector person or public or minister of government doesn't make that connection between the social reproduction, which is absolutely necessary for the economy to function, and how when they cut all of these services, the damage it is doing. So does that make any sense to you, Maria? Can you comment on how you think that is manifesting itself in the Dominican Republic?
I think I got it right, not sure, but it obviously manifests in it's too expensive to carry on with life. And then in terms of who is the first impacted on this is the women, because women are responsible for the families in the sense of providing care and all of the reproductive tasks, providing food, providing water, providing all of that. So when it is too expensive in the market, because of unregulated market or because of increase in tax, etc., or when the government does not provide the necessary social services, like for example, a place to bring your child so you can go to work or things like that. Ultimately, what happens is that women take the burden for free. So
Thank you, Maria.
Does that respond the question as you expected?
I'm just encouraging us all to make that point every single time this business of macroeconomic reform is put on the table, and emphasize that that part of who we are as women and our families is just forever at risk. And also, it's the way the state is reorienting itself, has reoriented itself, and is no longer taking the full responsibility for those services as a state should. So maybe it's the new model. And therefore, as we say in Jamaica, so it stands. But certainly it cannot be considered to be sustainable for the future without us being aware of the damage it is doing generally to large sectors of our society. Any other comments?
Yes, if I can add that
Maggie.
in. Yes, hi.
Yeah, good.
In Suriname, I think we have also a slightly different situation in that we did have a structural adjustment program in the 90s, but which was implemented only like half, perhaps even a quarter, because the government was very aware of that their popularity would go down, and we have the luxury of natural resources to kind of compensate for a lot of things. So basically the reorganization of for example, the civil service, they never did. And it's something that none of our governments ever did. When the government we have now, the Bautista regime, came into power, they flirted with IMF. And then at a certain point, the president came on television and he said, oh, he was so disappointed because these white people were so unfriendly and the things they wanted was not what he had in mind. So he shooed them away, which of course the people thought was wonderful. But then what they did was they went and took loans from the Chinese, like hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. We have no idea how on earth we're ever going to pay that back. And we have no idea what the conditions for those loans are. And what they do with the social services is they don't abolish them. They don't say like, okay, you're not going to be entitled to this anymore. They just don't pay them. So basically you will be entitled to get for example, like orphanages and institutions for elder people. You just wait for your subsidy for months and months and months and months, and it just doesn't come. And it just tell you, well, yeah, there's no money, so you know, just see how you feed those people. So it's a really you were asking a question, Jude, about whether ministers know what the implications are of the policies that they do. I don't think they care. I really honestly don't think they care.
That's part of the feeling here too. But Maggie, I wanted to ask us all a question though. Would you be interested in finding out then over the years, since you say that the governments never took on the IMF agreements full, like 100%, right?
True.
Would it be interesting for you to find out what percentage of the GDP the health budget was, and how has that been reduced over time? As a way of understanding how the government really thinks about the health services. What is the value they put on it? And then so it brings me now to, we can't discuss China today, but if our countries are indebted already to the IMF. In Jamaica's case, we have other external debtors. So in organizing for today, we also need to think about how to deal with that. Not in this module, but that's one of the things we have to deal with. It's a different kettle of fish, it appears to me, but our challenges remain the same. So the question is, how do we prepare for that, given the state of our economies?
True.
What kind of activism, what kind of advocacy work do we need to do to put back on the table, if we think it's appropriate, that the state really needs to get its act together and determine a larger role for themselves in providing these services for people for sustainable development? We can't answer that question now. I'm just throwing it out for us to consider, because I think it's to deal with today. We have to, at some point, talk about that.
Judith, maybe I could come in here now. It's Peggy here.
Yes, Peggy, I was going to do that.
Yes, so I want to start by saying that people are using different words. For instance, you talked about, today people are talking about macroeconomic reform. In the last module, we talked a lot about structural adjustment, neoliberalism, and Maggie just made the point that, and you too, Judith, that not all governments adopted this framework of structural adjustment. The Nassau understanding that I referred to last week was signed on to by the CARICOM governments, so not the governments of Suriname at that time or Dominican Republic. I was just talking about CARICOM. But the point I want to make in relation to St. Vincent is that St. Vincent government did not even have a debt crisis in 1984, when all of the CARICOM governments signed on to the Nassau understanding. But they adopted it nevertheless. In his very first budget address, Prime Minister Mitchell made
her on my headphones, so I don't disturb you. It does not happen yet.
Sorry, I think Audrey, your mic is open. I don't know. And he made it clear what it was all about. He talked about a mandate for change. Now, he did win by a landslide. So he talked about a mandate for change, and his mandate for change was to put an end to the wastage of economic resources, corruption in high places, and utter failure of public policy to come to grips with the problems facing society. So if you look at the slides that I've provided, but I'm not going to present them now, I've just summarized what he said and what he actually did. So the point I want to make here is that regardless of what our governments say, whether they acknowledge that they are falling within this framework of macroeconomic reform, neoliberalism, structural adjustment, whatever words they use. Another thing is public sector reform. Look out for words like that. There are certain words that mean, you know, the underlying meaning is basically the same thing. There is a new model of development. Margaret Thatcher said it very clearly at the beginning of the 80s. There is no alternative. So whether our governments have acknowledged it or not, everybody now, with the exception of some countries, I think Cuba might be one of them, is falling within this particular economic model. And if they do not, if they try to do something different, there are ways in which they can be punished, because, as Judith, as you said, we are all inserted into the global economy that is not designed to benefit people like ourselves. So that is the main point I wanted to make. The main difference between St. Vincent and Jamaica is, whereas Jamaica had a debt problem when it signed on to the structural adjustment agreements with the IMF, St. Vincent did not. But the result was the same, because, and it's the same also in all of our countries. And what I just want to support what you said, Judith, that people need to look and see what is happening in their countries. And the key things to look for are such things as cuts in social services, the privatization of government assets, the deterioration of services. So it's not even the cuts, it's the deterioration. In Barbados, one of the problems here is water. And I know that we have Stacia is here from the Barbados Water Authority. We've been having water problems for a number of years with the deterioration of the pipes, and some parts of the country has no water. And then there's a clamor to privatize water. So look for those clues that will indicate whether or not the government, whatever they say, have actually bought into this model. The switch to value-added taxes is another one to look for. The opening up of markets is another one to look for. The deregulation of the economy is another one. So that's all I really want to say at this point, that look behind the words to the actual practice, the actual policies, and that is where you will find the kind of economic model that everybody is supposed to follow today.
I also want to, following on what Peggy just said, to remind us that in 1984, when the CARICOM government signed the Nassau Agreement, that would have been just a little while after the Grenada invasion. I beg your pardon? The Grenada invasion. So the region ideologically was almost, my words, was under lock and key. And so when the CARICOM had signed on to the Nassau Agreement, some without even having a debt, it verifies for me the importance of the link between the politics of the day, hemispherically and globally, and the economic relationship to that. Because there's an economy that functions in support of those kinds of ideologies. So, and now, let us think about the region now and what kind of stress and strain politically some governments are under. It will be useful to reflect in your own country and how our countries are responding to that from North America. While we are indebted and North America is perhaps our largest trading partner, and maybe we are most indebted to North America up until the Chinese entered the game. So this just reaffirms for me why we need to understand and connect all the dots, the political economy dots, to the way that manifests on the ground in our own policies, which our governments design and implement, oftentimes using some language that it befuddles people, but it's the language of the international development partners that sends a message about less state intervention, supporting the private sector, etc. So just to...
This is Wanella. Can I say something?
Sure.
So I will say, on the topic of language, reading through the Nassau Understanding, I was like, oh, this is really good stuff. I'm like, all right, they're going to invest in education, they're going to put in technology. But I guess the main takeaway for me is to now ask, okay, you're investing in these areas, but can I see the budget items that you're actually going to cut?
There you go. Excellent question, because sorry to cut you, but what Peggy and I think Audrey, yes, made last week, when you look at the language, what they say they're going to do, and then what they actually did after was contradictory. So you're right, the language read beautifully, it was aspirational, but afterwards, what they actually did was cut spending and reduce support for certain critical services. So you're absolutely right. That we have to look, I mean, thank you for bringing that, reminding us of that.
Judith, some people are trying to get into the conversation. I'm just looking at the chat, and Joy is saying that we're trying to get in the discussion, but not
yes, sure. Yes, please, Joy, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
You have to unmute your mic if you want to speak.
Joy?
It's Susan.
Suzanne
Remember?
from Red Thread. Great. Go ahead.
I don't think they have something wrong on their side, Judith. Something's wrong with their audio and their speaker.
Hi, everyone. I'm not sure if you can hear me. This is Alexander.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you guys so much for welcoming to this really fantastic discussion.
Who is this?
This is Alexander Gervan.
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Judith. This has been a really rich discussion, and I just wanted to make a couple small additions.
Can you talk closer into your mic?
Yes. Is this any better right now?
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I think, you know, this discussion on the role of Chicago style or the Chicago School of Economics, which was popularized by Milton Friedman and really practiced and tested in Chile with the Pinochet dictatorship. Hello, can you guys hear me?
Keep your voice close to the mic. You're going in and out.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry about that. Hello, any better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. No, I just wanted to say, you know, it would be interesting for us to discuss the role of the Chicago School of Economics in this big picture, which was popularized by Milton Friedman and practiced under the Pinochet dictatorship. But I think the overall point of these macroeconomic reform structural adjustment agreements is that with this Chicago style economics, you try to tax the broadest possible base. You use essentially regressive taxation policies through the general consumption tax and the value-added taxes. And then you simultaneously liberalize the economy for larger corporations and for business people by reducing taxation on them. And really that has a large impact on the biggest breadth of the population, and women are disproportionately impacted. But this school of economics also emphasizes GDP growth and hardcore economic measures. And in emphasizing those measures, it reduces the importance of forms of production which are not included in GDP figures, which women disproportionately contribute to. These are household functions where there's no actual exchange of cash, but significant value is generated. I mean, this is, you know, the day-to-day things of essentially keeping a well-functioning household. This is not just, you know, food and child rearing. It's really a wide plethora of activities which are essential for the economy to function well. But because there's no actual exchange of cash, it's not included in the GDP figures, and thus it is generally de-emphasized and devalued. And I think that the overall philosophy of Chicago School Economics is going to affect women disproportionately because of that emphasis on only exchange values. So I think it's interesting also to look at the very command and control dominant political structures that are also coupled with that, if you look at the way governments function in the day. So I just wanted to introduce that because I think reading about the Chicago School of Economics, which of course, you know, Margaret Thatcher was also, you know, a huge proponent, affected us in the region, but also after it was tested in Chile, it was really spread throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and really affected women and the poor disproportionately. So that's just a small contribution there.
Thank you very much, Alex. That is, I don't know whether to say it's reaffirming, but it certainly, for me, it certainly reminds us of how deep the challenge is, and that we often don't see that particular route at where it was coming from. So thank you very much. Anything else? Anybody else? Did Red Thread get their thing together yet? Okay, Red Thread, please come in when you can. So we've spent a little while talking about Jamaica. Peggy reminded us that St. Vincent took a different path to an IMF agreement, although they didn't have a debt. And I want us to just look now at, so in addition to all the problems we still have, the challenges we still have, related in part to the way our economies are structured and how different parts of the economy are directed towards private capital and the benefits that reaps, etc. But there's some new kids on the block, some new challenges. For example, climate change. So we know as SIDS, we are particularly vulnerable because we're islands and we're beautiful tropical countries, but then warmer temperatures and changing rainfall patterns are wreaking havoc with agriculture and food production. That's one thing. And you have the temperatures and sea level rise. So in going forward, when we're thinking about how do we now organize to live, because each one of those climate change impacts singularly and together are going to affect our families. The women who are heads of households and their children, those same households in the Jamaican case are larger. They have more children and more adults under the leadership of the woman who is probably earning a very small income. So I'm just throwing that out. Mariama will, in her module, spend far more time on this, but I'm just throwing it out there for us to prepare ourselves to engage that, because going forward, those issues also have to be addressed regardless of the state of our economy. And, you know, unemployment is high and incomes are low. How do we organize ourselves to live in that context? Any comments on that from anybody?
Yes, I'd like to be able to say something here. This is Audrey Roberts.
Ah, thank you, Audrey.
How are you doing?
Good.
Good. I wanted to make the point that somewhere around in the 80s, and certainly it intensified in the 90s, as a kind of, I see it as a somewhat of a backlash to what governments were practicing, the structural adjustment programs and so on, and whatever name it's called. A rise in crime, a rise in an underground economy, almost as a, and in fact grew to such an extent that it really has a bigger money in it than any of the GDPs. And I think it is important to understand that because people had to find a way out. I certainly know that in Jamaica, some of the things that started to happen is that parishes, in some parishes like St. Elizabeth in the 80s, they almost completely switched from being the bread basket that they were for Jamaica, growing food crops, to creating, and in Westmoreland too, creating the growing of ganja and the illegal smuggling, if you like, or trading in ganja. We even had not airports, but airstrips and planes coming in and so on. So we had almost a high energy underground economy going on while people were struggling against these kind of policies. And I think it's spread to such an extent that, and so much of a join up amongst the Caribbean countries that were practicing these illegal, building this illegal underground economy, connecting with Mexico and so on. It grew to such an extent that it is really bigger than most of the GDPs of our countries. I don't think, I don't have figures, but I know that that was almost happening at the same time, simultaneously. This underground economy was growing, and I think there is a connection.
So thank you, Audrey, because Does anybody else want to comment on that before I make a link to something I was going to say? No? Okay, well, thank you, Audrey, because so Jamaica is the second most homicidal country in Latin America and the Caribbean, okay? We got that data from our conference we went to last. So what has happened there?
Morning.
Go ahead.
Morning.
Morning, who is this?
This is Wintress. It's Wintress.
Uh-huh.
You hear? I'm not so bright. I have a.
You're very bright. Go right ahead.
Yes. I'd like to talk about climate change. Thank you. I like to talk about climate change as it relates to Guyana.
Can you? There's a lot of.
And I want. Close you know, please. Yes, and I'd like to go back to when we first had the 2005 flood, and we were at wit's end as to know how to deal with it, why this happened. But at that time, we were not conscious about this thing that you call climate change. And so from then on, we begin to watch at our weather, and we know that we have two weather, rainy season and sunny season. But those seasons start changing. You start getting rain in August, which August is supposed to be a very dry month, and sun in June, which is supposed to be a very dry month. And so things start change. The seawall, our seawalls, also the sea level start rising and coming over the wall and even threatening our stockbrook market. So we have seen a lot of changes where climate change is concerned.
Three of them. Go ahead.
Finish. No, I'm done.
So you're actually emphasizing the need for us to now understand the extent
We have a little
is really making us even more vulnerable, and putting on the table how do we then organize ourselves, because climate change is not going to go away. So how do we then, in addition to everything else, address the challenges that are already coming with and will continue to come from climate change? Yeah? Any other comments? So no, I just want to make the link to the security issue. So part of the dilemma that the Jamaican government now faces is that the violent crime, as opposed to just regular crime, is now so bad that for the last 2 or 3 years, they have increased the budgetary commitment to crime, to the whole security sector. So it's more boots on the ground, more boats, more cars, more of those kinds of infrastructural things. And what they took a long time to understand, that that's not the solution to the problem, especially when they started cutting social intervention programs that they do provide some co-funding with, because the main funding is by international development partners. They said that they had no proof that the social interventions were working. So it became a political dilemma. And it's an indication, I think, of where the head of the sort of philosophically, the belief that you just have to put more police on the ground and have more states of emergencies. We have states of emergency, in 6 or 7 of the 13 parishes on the island. But we still have the highest murder rate, second highest murder rate in Latin America and the Caribbean. So that disconnect is part of what we certainly have to contend with in Jamaica going forward, in addition to all the other challenges, because the criminals are now technologically very savvy. So they are involved in cybercrime, and it really is a very complex situation, but we still have to address all of these things when we talk about how do we organize for now and going forward. Does anybody else want to make a comment on the crime situation throughout the region? Because we all have some version of it, I am sure.
Judith, Peggy here, while we're waiting for somebody to say something about it, I want to say that in a sense, turning to crime is also a way for some people organizing to live. If they have no other source of income, many people turn to activities that are criminalized. So there's definitely a connection between the deteriorating social services, the deteriorating economy, and crime.
Peggy, if I can add, oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, if I can add to that, because I was listening to Dr. Wheeler when he was talking about predator behavior, and I thought that was such a good term, because it's people using crime as a coping mechanism, you know, to deal with poverty and lack of services. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is that people are taking the rich people who don't give a damn as their role models. And so what I see here in Suriname is that all these young people who land up in prison or in gangs they cannot get out, is they want to have that same sneakers that the rich kids are wearing. They want to go to Burna Boy and Sizzla and everyone who's coming, and you cannot come in your old t-shirt. You need to buy this whole new outfit. You need to bring your girlfriend who buys the new outfit and the new weave and the new shoes and everything. So it's the coping mechanism with real needs at one hand, but it's also a living larger than life lifestyle that people see it as absolutely justified to steal for that, and that worries me much more than anything else.
So thank you, Maggie. So I believe there's a model towards the end where we will have to focus on some of the answers to the questions you just raised about going forward, because right away what comes to mind for me is the powerful role of social media, which has its positives, but certainly in the Jamaican case, it has been producing and is the root of replicating some of the most dangerous antisocial behavior in our schools.
Definitely.
So we need to throw that into the mix as well. That is part of the technological challenge that we are facing. Anything else? Peggy?
Judith, I don't know if there's a moment for me to make a reference to
Please do.
Something that I raised at the end of my slide. I talked about a community project, and it really, I wasn't going to suggest that we discuss that now, but if there's time, we might. I wanted to draw attention to, in the context of how we organize to live, I wanted to draw attention to the question of our relations. You know, in the first module number 2, when Rosina talked about different values, different forms of capital, different forms of wealth, we saw it was not just financial wealth. Social relations is another form of wealth, another form of capital. And these social relations are extremely important aspect of how we organize to live. In the St. Vincent case study, I just made a reference to a community-based project, and the way in which the project itself, in the process of working on that project, it built strong relationships between women in the community and the staff of government agencies that worked at community level, people like public health nurses, teachers, agricultural extension officers as they engaged in problem-solving activities aimed at improving the lives and livelihoods of the villagers. And so these relationships that were developed in the process of working together represent a kind of social capital that actually helped to mitigate the worst impacts of structural adjustment. Now, in the final module, which will be moderated by Alyssa Trotz, I know that she's going to make a reference, a very strong reference to some of the work that Red Thread did, how they organized to deal with the floods that Suzanne mentioned. So I don't want to leave this module without drawing attention to that as well. Something to think about as we try to answer that question. So yes, sometimes people organize to live by getting into crime, by emulating rich people, by stealing, by going into drugs, by going into prostitution, but also sometimes in the process of helping each other, they're also building other forms of resilience and strength. That's all I wanted to say on that one. But back to your questions, Judith, because we haven't heard from